Hey everybody, so in this video I'm going to talk about my section breakdown of my 524 on the MCAT. Now, I'm not just going to talk about myself in this video. I hope to draw lessons that you can apply to your studying process, in particular what I would call the macro studying process. That is to say, in general, how you want to see your scores improving or changing, or strategies that you might want to use. So to start with, I want to show you this chart over here. And this chart over here is if you take the MCAT, and you log into the website about a month later, they'll tell you when you're going to get your score about a month later. And you log into the website and you're going to see this. And this is going to show you your score on that exam. And notice a couple of things. So the most important column is probably going to be this one over here. And this column is going to show you your score. So you can see that there are, of course, 4 sections. I'm sure you guys are aware of this if you've been studying, but if not, I'm going to briefly talk about this. There are 4 sections, right? And each section is scored out of 132. And your overall score down here is going to be a total of your 4 section scores, right? So the maximum score that you can get, of course, on each section is a 132. And the total overall maximum is 528. Right? So you can see that I got a 524, which means that I missed 4 points, and you can see what sections I missed those points on, right? So you can see that I missed 2 points on this section, I missed 1 on this section, 1 on this section, and 0 on this section, right? So you can kind of think of scoring in that way as you miss some points on each section, and then your overall score is 528 minus the number of points that you missed per overall. Right? Now over here is what we call a confidence band, which is not particularly important. Essentially, it sort of tells you plus or minus 1. It's just kind of an estimate of, it's basically showing you that these scores are a little bit, they can vary depending a little bit. And this column I wouldn't say is particularly important. And then finally, this column over here, which tells you the percentile rank of your score. This column tells you for each section, what percent of people, what percent of test takers in the past 3 years did worse than you. So you can see, for example, for this one, that 96% of test takers did worse than a 130 on this particular section. And then they do that for all the sections of the test, and then they do that for the overall score down here, right? So I think it's fairly straightforward, not too difficult to understand this score breakdown. So I want to talk about the progress that I made for each section to ultimately get to this 524. Right. And of course, my initial test wasn't a 524. It was much lower than that. So I did a number of practice tests from various companies. And at some point, I decided to start graphing my progress. So let me show you the graph of my test progress. This is actually a graph that I made while I was studying. I was procrastinating my studying. I was kind of fed up with studying. And so this was something that I did for fun to procrastinate the studying. And so what I did essentially was that I graphed each section. So this was the Chem Phys section, this was my cars section, this was my Biochem section, and this was my Psych Soc section, right? So these colors represent each of these 4 sections. And what I did is I graphed them out. And so this line over here represents the overall score, right? And so you can see the overall score is going up. And this is roughly the order that I took these tests in. And I took some tests before this, right? But this is really when I started basically just doing full lengths toward the end of my studying, right? So let's go ahead and follow the progress, because I think there are a couple of lessons that I really want to show you that, that I used in my studying process that really helped me, and that really, I think, made me ultimately max out my overall score. So first and foremost, I want to draw your attention to the blue line over here. So the blue is the Chem Phys section of the MCAT. So let me show you, let's go ahead and write out what the scores were. So this was a 129. Down here, it was a 128, 129 again, and then we've got 130, right? And so it keeps going as a 130. And then my overall, of course, my final score was also a 130. So I've been very open that the Chem Phys was my worst section and was the section that I found the most difficulty on. I was not a science major. I was not a engineering major. I was a political science major. And so for me, especially a lot of the physics, a lot of the orgo, a lot of the gen chem, that stuff I had to review quite a bit. So I had to spend a long time reviewing those subjects, and most of my review up until the point of these full lengths, up until this graph, is really me reviewing the Chem Phys section. But something that you notice here is that at some point I start scoring basically the same. So I got 129, 128, 129, and then I start scoring a 130. And I pretty much maintain that 130 for the last 3 tests that I take and the real MCAT. And that's not entirely an accident. So essentially what happened was that I looked at my score right about here when I was getting these 130s, and I told myself, a 130 on this section is pretty good. A 130 on this section, I worked really hard for this 130. I probably spent more time, more work on that 130 than I did on all the other sections combined, I would say. And I spent so much time on that. And I told myself, look, to get higher than that is going to be really, really difficult. I'm happy with that score, and I'm going to work on the other sections, right? And so essentially what I did is for the last several weeks, I really did very little review of Chem Phys. I did very little Chem Phys review, and almost all my review, I would say virtually all my review was concentrated on the other sections. And the reason, again, is because I felt that I had maxed out on that Chem Phys section, and that a lot of the stuff that I had left to learn, right? So I was missing some questions, of course. A 130 means you miss typically around seven questions, give or take, on each section. And so I was missing some questions, but I told myself those questions are typically so low yield that they're not really worth my time, and I would rather maximize my time on these other sections. Okay, so that's the story of the Chem Phys section, which is that I essentially was able to get that 130. I was able to maintain that 130 on my last 3 full lengths, and so I didn't really study it in the last several weeks. And I was very lucky, of course, to be able to get that 130 on the actual MCAT. I mean, because there was a chance that I might have dropped a couple of points just randomly because of the jitters of test day or whatever. But very luckily, I was able to maintain that 130 for actual test day. So now let's take a look at the other sections, because the other sections I think are a lot more interesting. There's a lot more variation in the other sections. So take a look at cars, first of all. Cars, you see, goes from this 127 down here up to a 131, down to a 130, up into a 132, 132, down to a 130, and then finally a 131. So that's that's a lot of fluctuation. You can see it's a general trend upward, right? It's generally a pretty good trend. And so I also didn't study cars in the last several weeks. And this score, I gotta admit, this score scared me a little bit. This random drop, but this was not an AAMC test. This was a blueprint test. And blueprint, frankly, most of the other test makers, most of the non-AAMC test makers, in my opinion, their cars sections are really not good. The way they write their questions, even their passages, frequently there's a lot more ambiguity in their questions than there should be. So in my opinion, frankly, I don't recommend students use cars from any other test maker other than the AAMC. And so I kind of disregarded this score. I assumed it was kind of an anomaly. And you can see that it basically was, because if you erase that, then I was scoring between a 130 and a 132 on cars. And so test day, essentially got me right smack in the middle of that range, between a 130 and a 132. And of course, it ended up being a 131 right in the middle of those two. And I was pretty happy with that. I mean, that's fine, right? I was lucky to get that cars in between my other full lengths. So you can see so far that my actual test basically followed my full lengths, right? The Chem Phys was a flat line in the last several weeks. The cars, of course, was a bit of a range, I would say, between 130 and 132, but I ended up in the middle of that at 131, so pretty reasonable. Let's take a look at Biochem now. So again, as I said, I didn't really study Chem Phys. I didn't really study cars in the last few weeks, really in the last month. And again, the reason is that I thought Chem Phys I was doing well. So when I was taking these practice tests, I was reviewing them. I was reviewing the questions, and when I got questions wrong, or when I wasn't sure about a question after the fact, I would go and I would review that material. But other than that, I did no other review of Chem Phys, and I did no other cars practice. So I only did the cars practice of my actual full lengths, right? Biochem was different. So of course, Biochem, you can see, was a 128 here, and then down to a 127 here, and then up to a 131, a 132, back down over here to a 128, up here to a 132, and then a 131 on the actual test. So there's a lot of variation there. And I think the reason why there was a lot of variation there is that I had some aspects of biochem and bio that I was strong in, and some aspects that I was weak in. So if I encountered a test that tested heavily the material that I wasn't as good at, I did pretty badly. And when I encountered tests that tested material that I was good at, as you can see, I got 2 132s. So, there's a bit of a mixed bag there, but I gotta say that when I was taking it at the time, this really scared me. Because that's like 4 points less than that 132, and that would drop my overall score, of course, by 4 points. And so that was very concerning, and that's why I spent a substantial amount of my last few weeks studying biochem. So mainly what I did, especially when it came to this sample test, especially when I was reviewing this sample test, is that I really, really tried to review my weak points. And so in the last few weeks, I reviewed metabolism. I basically went right back through the whole systems of metabolism, cellular respiration, all that stuff, basically from scratch. And I went and like redrew it out and relearned it. And when it came to some of the lower yield bio stuff, I went and reviewed that. So I was missing some, I would say I was missing some lower yield bio content. And again, if that content came up on the test, then I would, you would see it in my score. And so again, I spent those last few weeks reviewing that. And overall, I ended up with a 131, which I was, again, pretty happy with, right? It ended up toward the higher end of that range. Not quite the 132 that I had hoped for in some of these, but still a pretty solid score. And so again, I got pretty lucky, right? Now, the final section, of course, let me erase this. The final section is the Psych Soc. Now, Psych Soc is quite interesting. So take a look at Psych Soc. So I got this 129, I got this 130, 129, 129, 130, 130, and then on the actual test, it jumped to a 132. Now, this, I have to admit, is partly luck. Part of it is I just got lucky and got that 132 on this test. But part of it is also the fact that from the beginning, I had decided that I needed to do some Psych Soc review at the end of my test. So Psych Soc, and I'll do a video separately on how to review Psych Soc, but essentially what it came down to is there was some vocab that I needed to review that I was kind of putting off. And so the last several days before my test, I virtually spent that entire time just studying Psych Soc, mostly studying Psych Soc vocab and reviewing a little bit of Psych Soc concepts. Now, admittedly, I didn't think I would jump to that 132, but I was hoping to at least keep that 130 and maybe jump up 1 point. I didn't expect this. But regardless, I did recognize that Psych Soc was a weak point of mine that I could review over a short period of time, right? So compare, for example, Psych Soc for a second to Chem Phys, right? Let's take a look at that Psych Soc. So Psych Soc looks like this, right? It's between a 129 and a 130, and Chem Phys is between also a 129 and a 130. So why did I decide to spend that last week reviewing Psych Soc? Very simple answer. All the stuff that I was missing on Chem Phys was all low-yield Chem Phys stuff that would have taken me forever to review. So I thought to myself, this doesn't really make sense. That there's no way I'm going to be able to jump up any more points, right? When I was reviewing the tests, I was looking at the questions I was getting wrong. I was like, yeah, that's just I had to write that off, essentially. Those are questions that I'm not going to be getting because that's such low-yield material that if I had to review all the low-yield material, there's nothing I could do. Whereas with Psych Soc, I looked at that and I said, oh, these are just terms that I'm missing. These are terms that I need to refresh my memory on. These are terms that I need to learn. And so for me, I chose to devote that last week to Psych Soc. And of course, it paid off, right? It paid off in a jump of 2 points, which again, as I said, I was not expecting, but was very happy with. So a couple of general lessons that I hope you can kind of understand from my test experience. First of all, you want to review the section that you're doing worst at, right? So for me, cars didn't make sense to review because it was already pretty good. And so for me, I didn't want to review cars. I didn't review cars. Now, second thing is review the section that you're missing the most high yield content on, right? So for me, that was Psych Soc. And I think for most people, it would probably not be the Chem Phys section, right? The Chem Phys section contains the most low yield content and in general contains the widest amount of content. And so that's a section that whose improvement I would say is probably the most difficult to make, right? So again, in terms of which section to focus on, number one, your lowest section. Number two, the section with the most room for improvement. And then number three, I would say the section with the most fluctuation or the most variance. So Biochem, there was a big fluctuation, and so I chose to focus on that. Chem Phys, there was no fluctuation by the end, so I chose not to focus on that, right? And so again, these principles you can take in deciding on which sections to focus on, especially as you get down to the final weeks or the final month or two, or depending on how long you've given yourself to study, as you get down into the home stretch of your studying. Now, the final point I want to make, and this is a very, very important point, so please please make sure to focus on this point, which is that there is always an element of luck. There's always an element of luck to your score, right? I got very lucky to jump those 2 points. In some respects, my final score was fairly lucky on a lot of these sections, right? So this one was probably the most expected score, but that cars could have easily been down to a 130, that Biochem could have easily been down 1 or 2 points, and I might have ended up with a much lower score. So there was a possibility, and there is an element of luck. And so what I would say is for the actual test day, make sure you get a good night's sleep, make sure you're you're on your game. Plan your sleep ahead from several weeks in advance. Make sure you're sleeping at the time you want to sleep for your test date. Make sure you wake up at your test date. Make sure you know what kind of breakfast you want to eat. Things like that. Make sure that you're on your game so that you can really maximize your overall score on test day. And then also keep in mind that there's an element of luck, but there's not that much luck. So you can see that for every one of my section scores, again, with the exception of that slightly bizarre Psych Soc, all of my section scores were basically between, somewhere in the range of all of my practices, right? So if you're doing well on your practices, if you like the range of your practice section scores, then go into the test confident, being fairly confident that you're probably going to get within that range, right? That you're probably going to get somewhere between your best score and your worst score on your practice tests, especially in the last few weeks or the last month or so, right? And finally, the last point I want to make is that reviewing, even in the last week or so, does make a bit of a difference, right? We saw that with the Psych Soc, so don't neglect that, and don't think that you're not going to be able to improve even in that last week. But of course, you're not going to be able to jump, several points, maybe like 4 or 5 points. That's pretty unlikely. You're probably going to get a score that's very close to your practice scores. And when I say close to your practice scores, keep in mind I mean close to your practice scores in each section, right? I don't necessarily mean the overall score. So I typically don't look as much at the overall score because each section score I think is much more interesting and much more important for really understanding the progress that you're making. And so that's all I wanted to talk about here. I hope this video was instructive. I hope you learned a decent amount from this video. Do keep in mind that this is just one person's experience. This is just my experience, and people have different experiences. There are rare cases in which somebody jumps up many, many points or jumps down several points, but usually those are fairly unusual cases, and a lot of time there's a story behind it, especially when people drop a number of points. For example, they only got 2 hours of sleep, or something happened on the way to the exam, and so they arrived very frazzled, or something to that effect. And so again, overall, there are some exceptions, but I think overall these rules are good rules to follow and good principles to go by when you're reviewing for your MCAT. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll give you an answer. And if you have any personal questions, you can always shoot me an email, and my email is up here, so take a look at that. And thank you for watching.